All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to week are we in? 11. Um, so this week we are here with Jessie Sage to go over really sex work, surveillance, anti-pornography, politics. Jessie, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. I'm Jessie Sage. I am a writer. I'm the Pittsburgh City Paper sex columnist. And I have a podcast called When We're Not Hustling, which is about sex work and sex workers. I have been a long time in the sex industry. I started in 2014, so this year is 10 years. I've done a lot of different jobs within the sex industry. Right now I'm doing mostly escorting, and I have a long history of sex work activism in the city and also online. So this is my full-time thing now.
Yeah, great. Yes, and I know before we started recording, we were just talking about your latest column
Mhm.
in terms of history, Pittsburgh, and sex work. So I think bringing that into this discussion today would be amazing.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. It's such a coincidence because when I opened up your readings for today and you were reading Gail Rubin, and Gail Rubin was talking about the impact of second wave feminism on pornography and anti-sex work feminism and swerves, it hit home to me because this week on earlier this week I published a piece on Shirley Cavanagh, who was a sex worker who in 1957 shot a cop who wasn't just any cop. He was the head of Pittsburgh's Vice Squad. So he was in charge of policing narcotics and sex work. And she was having an affair with him. So the story is what happened. This is
It's
all
such a
so
good story.
sordid. I mean, it sounds like it's a very sordid tale. And the thing that's really interesting about it is that it happened in Pittsburgh and that her grandson, who is I think in his early 40s right now, is living in Pittsburgh, and he just recently wrote a book about this. And the book was trying to figure out what happened with his grandmother because when he grew up, he heard stories around his family. I mean, she had died before he was born, but he heard stories kind of floating around of from the family saying, "Yeah, grandma was a prostitute who shot a cop," and everybody was just like, "Oh yeah, that seems normal. Like that happens in every
Yeah,
family."
welcome to Pittsburgh. Yeah.
And he really wanted to get a sense of like what exactly happened and how did it happen that she shot a cop and only spent 2 months in jail. She spent 2 months in jail. And the story is, and I think this is relevant to what you guys are reading with Gail Rubin, the story is that she was having an affair with him. He was using her basically as an informant. She was working in a brothel. And back in the day, in the 50s, there were brothels in Pittsburgh. There aren't now, but there were. And that has a lot to do with the policing of sex work as well, and anti-sex work feminism. But there were brothels. She was working in a brothel, and he went in and started using her to feed him information so that they could police that brothel. And they had this very tumultuous affair. She was obviously doing that work to like get out of being policed and in trouble herself. And he got drunk one day and was at a bar and called her and basically ordered her to come see him at the bar and was being belligerent. And the story is, and this is really unclear, so I want to just say that like even her grandson, who did a massive amount of research on what happened, is a little fuzzy on what happened, but it seems like he pulled the gun out on her to threaten her because he was being a abusive lover.
Yeah.
And she batted it away, and in the process of batting it away, he was shot with his own gun. Now, the reason that this all of these details are so mushy is because he claimed that he shot himself. He didn't want anyone to know that she was there. And that's because I mean, he was married, he's having an affair, he did a really stupid thing. So he lied about it. And but obviously they were in a public place, like people knew that she was there. And so um the long and the short of the story that's interesting to me and to what you guys are doing is that when she was in jail, the city of Pittsburgh rallied around her. Well, the ACLU supported her and said that they would help with the case. There was lawyers who offered to do the work pro bono. There was a lot of support from the city, and especially from the women of Pittsburgh who were sending in letters to the lawyers, tons of letters. There was a committee of 70 who was writing in, talking about how Shirley should be freed. When Shirley, there was a whole bunch, there was newspaper articles in the Post-Gazette, and this is wild to me, of women saying that they would discourage their husbands from ever going into the police force because of how Shirley was treated.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
so, I mean, there was this massive support behind her, and seeing her as like kind of a victim of circumstance and of police brutality and of police corruption, basically.
Yeah.
So, and when she was let out, there were there was people who were writing in saying that when she got let out of jail, that they would let her stay with them. They were sending money in her support. There was just like, and as I'm reading this as a Pittsburgh sex worker and as a Pittsburgh sex worker who's worked on like the policing of sex workers in Pittsburgh, with in coalition with places like the ACLU, Pittsburgh's ACLU, and other organizations here, I was struck by the fact that like I can't imagine this happening now, that there is no way that a sex worker could shoot a cop in a public setting and have the city stand behind her. And I was, doing a lot of thinking about that. And I was thinking that probably, I mean, obviously we have to call out the fact that she was a white woman and that this wouldn't
Yeah.
happen if she was a woman of color. But at this point, it wouldn't happen like this if she was a white woman either in 2024. And I think that a lot of this has to do with anti-sex work feminism, with second wave feminism that saw women, that continues to think of sex as paid rape, as sex with sex workers as paid rape, as pornography, as somehow like contributing to the subjugation of women, and as women in the sex industry, as sex workers in various forms, as like prostitutes and escorts and porn performers, everything as co-conspirators in the subjugation and abuse of women. And so surely that this woman, Shirley Cavanagh, which was her name, wasn't seen by the public in Pittsburgh, wasn't seen by the women of Pittsburgh as co-conspirators in their own abuse. Like
Mhm.
that just wasn't like a framework through which they were seeing her. Whereas
Right.
now it is very much the case that women who are working in the sex industry, for the most part, I mean, there's a few like allies, but for the most part, conservatives don't like sex work and liberals don't like sex work either, and are
Yeah.
viewing sex work through the lens of trafficking and also through this like anti-sex work rhetoric of or anti anti-porn,
Yeah.
anti-sex work, feminist position. And so that all seems really important to me to think about, like, what were the consequences of thinking of sex work and porn through this like feminist lens on the women who are actually doing the work.
Yeah. Thank you for of course the recap. And I think even the smaller tidbits that still say so much, specifically what stands out to me, of course, and my research of cops abolition,
Mhm.
and one of the readings we read today by an abolitionist, thinking about really that power of wives saying, "You're not going to join the
Yeah.
force,"
Mhm.
knowing how good of a job that is in terms of pay, stability, all
Yeah.
of those things.
Right.
So there's already this massive financial shift,
Yeah.
protection, all of those things that you're absolutely right. This even like that part of
Right.
a small housewife movement of saying you're not going to
Right.
do this.
It almost seemed like almost a Liz Estrada sort of thing that I was
Yes.
like, what?
Yes.
Like, and that the paper was printing that there was like a coalition of women who were
Yeah.
like, not my husband. I would
Yeah.
not support that. Like, they can't be
Yeah.
cops because look at how they treat women, you know? And thinking of the solidarity, like thinking of their solidarity as being with the sex workers and not
Mhm.
with like their husbands is actually very interesting to me.
It's so fascinating. And so I think you're really hitting on something, particularly with second wave feminism, where,
Hmm.
yeah, this, especially with our understanding of first wave feminism
Yeah,
having obviously all of its own problems,
sure.
but that sex work was not viewed in this way that we see Gail Rubin talk about in
Right. Hmm.
anti-pornography politics. So I think one of the biggest um, themes within
Yeah.
Rubin's piece is talking about how, for women and femmes, seeing sex workers as needing saving. Uh,
Yeah.
can
Hmm.
you talk a little bit about like how this became an idea and became so warped, and how it's really continued even in whatever wave of feminism we're in now?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that that's really, I think that that's a really interesting story. So obviously in second wave feminism, when you had people like Gloria Steinem was actually one of them. Uh oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking at right now. I don't know why. All of the anti-porn crusaders.
Yeah.
There
Like the
was
big ones we
the
know
big ones
were
we know.
anti-sex work. Yes.
Yeah, they were all anti-sex work. And part of the reason that this is very interesting. I recently, in my podcast, had a conversation with my mom about why she was so against my work when I started it. That was like very difficult conversation to have. You guys can listen to it if you want to. But it was interesting because my mom was saying that the reason that she was very upset about my work was when she found out about it was that she came of age during second wave feminism. Like she was like, I don't have a moral problem. It's not that I'm icked out by sex, like because, she's not particularly Christian or like doesn't have that sort of like religious um background or moralizing that a lot of people do. But what
Mhm.
she does have is she grew up with Gloria Steinem and all of the second wave feminists. And she was talking very explicitly about how much of an impact that had on her thinking. And she
Yeah.
was saying that for her, it wasn't necessarily about sex or for her, and by her, I mean like her generation of
Yes.
women.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily about her feelings about sex. It was about power. And the way that they were looking at this is that sex workers were allowing themselves to be under men in a very, very explicit way. So my mom said, these are my mom's words. I would not say this because this is not how I characterize my job. My mom said, I didn't like it because when I was growing up, I thought that we had worked hard enough that we don't have to suck dick for a living. That sucking dick for a living was like the worst thing that you could imagine doing because it is letting men use you as an object. And coming out of second wave feminism, I mean, we talk about objectification and like the language of objectification so much now, but that didn't exist prior to second wave feminism. We didn't
Right.
talk about like objectification and what it meant for women to be objectified in the same way. And so like for her and for a lot of the like second wave feminists or the people who are coming out of that, this idea that like women's bodies in pornography and in other forms of sex work were being used as objects for men's pleasure. And there is really like explicit language coming out of like Andrea Dworkin, who's one of the people that I would, who was one of the most influential people in this movement who were talking about like sex workers as holes to be filled and used. And that language and that emphasis on sex workers and porn performers as being just used for their body for the purpose of men is
Mhm.
something that I think a lot of second wave feminists, and in the words of my mom, who is like ringing in my head now because I just recently had this
Yeah.
conversation, um, they were like, we fought hard to not have to do that, to
Yeah.
not have to be these objects for male pleasure. And I think it was very hard for people within that milieu to think about sex work in any other um light, to think
Yeah.
about to understand the idea of like women having agency within that. Like it's inconceivable that women could, that I think now, like we've come to a place now, at least within the sex worker rights movement, not necessarily within the culture writ large, but in the sex worker rights movement, we've come to have an entire language and vocabulary of sex work as a choice among choices. As far as you can make a choice under capitalism, like we
Right.
all have to somehow, we're all coerced to do work of some sort. So,
Right.
but as being something that women or femmes or anybody really, but this is always aimed at like women and femmes,
Mhm.
can make a choice to enter into for reasons of their own, and that choice can be like a valid choice. And so,
Right.
I think that there's there was such a push against that, as at the same time there's this like push for women to be like in the workforce, but that workforce is obviously looking very masculine. And like my mom admitted that. My mom was like, yeah, we had this idea that we don't have to suck dick for a living. Instead, we can be like the white boys and like get the jobs that they have. I
Right.
think that there's a point that we're getting to now where people are like, well, that was dumb. Like, you know,
Yeah.
like, do we all want to be white men?
In a boardroom. Right.
In a boardroom, like, do we really want that? Is that the life that we want? And there's a lot of like, there's within the sex worker movement, there's a big push, and this is coming out of a lot of like leftist circles too, and especially post COVID, of like sex work as anti-work, or as a
Yeah.
pushback against the notion of work at all. And that's not to say that like we're not thinking about sex work as a job, because obviously it's a job, but is it anti-capitalist? Does it change like the way in which we think about like work? Because many of the people who are working as sex workers are now independent, who aren't
Right.
they don't have bosses. They're not like doing things in the same way that they were in the past. So I don't know if that answers your
It
question.
absolutely does. Especially because I'm thinking our moms are of the same
Yeah.
generation. And um I also grew up hearing those,
Yeah.
also hearing that mixed, of course, with religious
Yeah.
ideology.
Hmm.
But not even, because we see so much Christian puritanical
Oh,
ideology
yeah. Hmm.
rooted as the American way, that
Right.
it's sometimes difficult to even untangle those two things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I think the idea of, we fought to do this so you don't have to,
Right.
a
Hmm.
very pervasive idea
Yeah.
that is difficult. I know I personally grew up with a lot of puritanical guilt, even if I
Yeah.
didn't believe religious
Yeah.
doctrine or whatever.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, of how sex alone is
Right. Right.
discussed. And so we
Yeah.
have how sex is discussed in society,
Yeah.
and then you bring in sex work, and then you bring in feminism looking at labor rights. You
Right.
kind of have this cluster of,
You
this is not
do.
going to end well.
No. Yeah, you do. You have this confluence of like forces that come together to have this very anti-sex work
Yeah.
position. And I think that that's impacted like everything. And right now, and I think a lot of people don't realize this, but right now that sort of basically the anti-pornography feminists lost the porn wars. Like,
Yeah.
in the sense that, I mean, they're trying to regain footing, but they ultimately lost the porn wars. Like,
Yeah.
pornography exists, and pornography exists like way in at a much larger scale than it ever did at any other time.
Right.
What they and Morality in the Media was an organization that worked to try to end pornography. It was an anti-pornography movement. What Morality in the Media has done that has been very, very smart strategically was to rebrand as the center. Oh my gosh, I'm going to totally blank. It's like the Center for against exploitation in the sex industry, whatever that acronym is that I'm
Yeah.
blanking on right now. But basically, what they did. to end trafficking and exploitation in the sex industry. So they've instead rebranded and said, no, we're not talking about pornography. We're talking about trafficking and exploitation. And this is a really smart political move because while people could be like, I don't care about pornography, we all care about
Yeah.
trafficking. And so there's become in the last 10 years in particular, there's very strong conflation of sex work and trafficking, where all of the legislation and everything is being pointed toward is being labeled as anti-trafficking, but it's actually anti-sex work. And
Yeah.
so anti-sex work and anti-pornography and anti-free speech. So in 2018, FOSTA SESTA was passed, which was a anti-sex trafficking bill and law. And it wasn't actually anti-sex trafficking at all. It was anti-prostitution. And so what happened when FOSTA SESTA passed is that it undid Section 230. This is in your article that Mr. Snow wrote, but it
Yeah.
undid Section 230 of the
The telecommunications. Yeah. Or
telecommunication.
expanded for the internet. Yeah.
Yeah. And what that did is it made it so that any of the platforms that we're working on, any like Craigslist, all of the social media platforms, anything like Reddit, anything that third parties can post to, Section 230 protected those companies from being held liable for what people write. Because you can't police everything that anyone puts on Craigslist, for example. It's like almost impossible. So they're like, okay, at the beginning of the internet, this went into place in 1996. At the very beginning of the Section 230 did, the very beginning of the internet, they're like, we cannot have an internet if we hold platforms responsible for everything that anybody posts. Like it just isn't feasible. And then in 2018, that was undone. And so what happened was there was this shuttering of erotic content on the internet altogether. So that means Craigslist personals came down, Tumblr died basically because all of the erotic content went off of it. Or like the moderation for sexuality on the internet became like very, very intense because all of a sudden all of these platforms were afraid that they were going to be charged with trafficking if there was any sort of sexual exchanges happening by way of the internet. And basically the way that the bill was written, it had nothing to do with trafficking at all. It said that these platforms could be held responsible for the facilitation of prostitution. The thing is that what people don't seem to understand is that prostitution has no legal definition. It's different in no federally legal definition. It's different in every single state. And in some states, for example, like money has to be exchanged for penetration. In some states, somebody has to actually come, which is bizarre. There's like all of these different definitions of what it is that prostitution is. Does oral sex count as prostitution? Does dominatrix works count as prostitution? Like what is that? And there's also no definition of facilitation. So does facilitation just means to make something easier or more accessible. So is SWAP, like the Sex Worker Outreach Project, who's talking about safety measures and doing harm reduction, when they're doing that, are they facilitating prostitution because they're making it like easier or more accessible? So also what happened is that a lot of sex work organizations and harm reduction organizations stopped functioning too, because they were also afraid of getting charged with trafficking. So now trafficking is defined as facilitating prostitution, but nobody knows what prostitution is and nobody knows what facilitation is. So everything just shuts down. And that means that there's also like all of these porn websites that are very afraid of but prior to FOSTA SESTA, it was fairly common for sex workers or for porn performers, for example, to raffle dates with fans, and now they can't do that, so there's like all these things that were part of the norms that had to be completely shut down. So that I think that it's important to think about the fact that the reason that that passed almost unanimously is because the language around it was an anti-trafficking bill. And it's really difficult for anybody on either side to say like, oh no, I'm for trafficking. Like nobody's going to say
Right.
they're for trafficking. But
Right.
how do you vote against an anti-trafficking bill with and then like express that nuance to a constituency that is like totally alarmed by
Well,
trafficking and sex
there's
work?
your issue. You just
Yeah.
said express the nuance. We don't do nuance.
No, we don't do
We
nuance.
don't
And
do
so
nuance. That you can't put that on a bumper sticker or on a political ad.
right, right. So basically, this whole anti-pornography movement became an anti-trafficking movement,
Right.
which is still an anti-pornography movement, but it's rebranded as an anti-trafficking movement
Right.
that now has had huge impacts on sex workers of all kinds and has made everything more difficult and less safe.
And then in terms of actually combating sex trafficking, because that's not the real focus of the work. It's not that
No, no,
actual
and
trafficking is being impacted.
no, and I like to say when I talk about this that if you look at the language of the bill, like it's not as if any money was put toward like helping trafficking victims. So I think it's important to say that sex work, it's really important to say that sex work and sex trafficking are not the same thing. Like labor trafficking is a major ordeal, like a major deal. It's a major deal in sex trafficking. It's a major deal in our agricultural trafficking. It's a major, like, it's a big deal across all forms of labor, not just the sex industry. It's just that when we're talking about the sex industry, people can have a moral panic about that in the way that they're not with the migrant farmers.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that you can bring in like Christian moralizing and all this stuff, and then people start to panic. So it's not as if sex workers don't believe that trafficking is bad and should be stopped. It's just that the laws that we have in place to like try to protect people from sex trafficking are in no way protecting people from sex trafficking. And I think it's really important to note that this mostly impacts like the most marginalized sex workers, and in particular like migrant sex workers and undocumented sex workers whose workplaces, the massage parlors, the like strip clubs that they work at, everything else, when those places get raided, there's always news stories, and this is something that's important to pay attention to, of those workers being arrested and being deported. So the idea is these like poor women in these massage parlors are all being trafficked, but then when they do raids there, it's the women who are being punished. It is not whoever they assume is trafficking them.
Right.
It's basically yeah. And I mean, there's been so many like awful stories, like Sung Yang is one of them, where when her massage parlor got raided in New York, she jumped out of a second story window and died because the idea of being arrested and deported was worse for her than like any help from the police. There is no help from the police. And
Right.
so and you also see that with like down in Florida a couple of years ago, Robert Kraft, the owner of the football team. I don't know anything about sports, but the football guy got arrested, like got in trouble for like a trafficking ring down there.
Mhm.
But what ended up happening is he didn't face any charges at all. And the women who worked at the massage parlor who were ostensibly trafficked,
Mhm.
had to pay fines for prostitution, and some of them were arrested. And this is policing of women, of femmes, of undocumented people, and of people of color, and of trans women
Yeah.
too, and not of whoever it is that they think is trafficking these people.
Right. Well, and I think we in class we talked a few weeks ago um, about not about sex trafficking, but about the film The Sound of Freedom and the alt-right's use of the idea of
Yeah,
sex trafficking, particularly around children, and how
yeah,
it is that a political movement that ties to QAnon and like Jim Caviezel's using his Hollywood to
yeah,
further this film. all based, all essentially made up, rooted in some pieces that are somewhat true, but let's make this a better political campaign, political
Right.
move.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think similar to what you said, especially when children are involved,
Yeah.
of course, you're not going to say you are pro-trafficking.
No.
And so there's already an unfair like argument that has started through
Right.
this
Mm-hmm.
umbrella,
Mm-hmm.
this conflating. And I think with what you were talking about in terms of facilitating and especially the language of aiding and abetting,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
that I think it's Snow's article that points
Yeah.
out, okay, the connection between anti-sex work, anti-pornography politics with
Yeah.
Reuben has direct connections that we are seeing play out even with abortion.
Yeah.
And I just want to read Samuel Alito's part of his opinion,
Yeah.
writing for the
Mm-hmm.
majority, saying that the right to terminate a pregnancy could, and the amount of power that's within that could,
Yeah.
uh, to terminate a pregnancy could license fundamental rights to illicit drug use, prostitution, and the like.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, when we already see a structural
Yeah.
setup of putting narcotics, drug use, and
Yeah.
sex work together,
Right.
that's its own. We probably do not have time for that.
Right.
Um,
Like that's what vices is. That's what vice policing
exact,
is.
exactly.
Those are placed together, policed together.
Um,
And
and
actually, I think it's important to note that when I was that in Pittsburgh, and I'm not doing the same sort of organizing now, but when I was doing it, that the way that we had what they called the Pride Court, and when people were arrested for prostitution related offenses, they had to go through one particular diversion program, and that diversion program required drug treatment, regardless of whether the people who were arrested had a drug problem at all. That it was just like assumed and baked into the punishment that whoever was doing sex work also was doing illicit drugs and not only using them, but had like a problem that needed to be corrected.
I mean, what do we say to that except for seeing how ingrained and
Yeah.
systematic
Hmm.
this
Yeah.
is at such the legal level, where
Yeah.
we talk about having social safety nets and community
Right.
care, where the system is quite literally set up to conflate issues and to
Right. Hmm.
not get at roots
Yeah.
of actual problems of
Right.
treating actual drug addiction,
Right. Hmm.
and the idea of choice of choosing
Yeah.
sex work being just completely foreign to the legal
Right.
system.
Right. Right.
Could you talk a little bit about, I think that connection between what's happening with abortion, access specifically, on the internet, thinking, and then also sex work that we see these.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that I mean, we're talking about bodily autonomy in
Yeah.
both cases. And I think it's important to point this out. We're talking about bodily autonomy. We're talking about like having the choice to use our bodies in the way that we want to or don't want to, which means like using our bodies as a means of income, which by the way, everybody does. Like, and like there is no, and that looks like a lot of different things, but like for the most part, most people use their bodies in some way for their jobs. It's just that when you do it in a sexualized way, people freak out.
Yeah.
So I just like that's a side note,
You
but
use your body to make money, period. Like that's it.
we're not just floating heads. Even
Yeah.
intellectuals have to like sit at a desk and use their body to type out
Yes.
their books that they're writing. And I think that so what we're talking about when we're talking about sex work is the right to be able to use our body in a way that makes us money, to be able to choose to interact with our clients and with our bodies in the way that we decide to, and to labor through our bodies in the way that we want to or we decide to. So there's that. And then I also think that, like, when we're talking about abortion, it's the same issue. Do people who get pregnant have the right to decide what they're going to do with those pregnancies? Do they have the right to decide if their body is going to be used as a vessel for, like, birth giving or not? And I mean, I think that, like, we have to, when we're having the conversation about abortion rights, also have a conversation about what it means to be able to use our bodies autonomously. I
Mhm.
also think that one of the things that we should think about, and we should think about, like, sex workers, like how sex work is being policed um in this regard, and how this is going to impact abortion access, is that what happened with FOSTA SESTA and with all this anti-trafficking stuff is that the aiding and abetting that you're talking about, the facilitation that you're talking about, became criminalized. So what this means for sex workers, and I think this will be very important for abortion too, what this means for sex workers is that sex workers, it's fairly common for sex workers to do this thing that we call duos, which means that, like, you and another sex worker have a threesome with a client. That's like a common thing to do because it's a common fantasy. So,
Mhm.
like, what has happened with a lot of people who have done duos together is that if they've gotten busted, they've gotten arrested, not just for solicitation, which is a really minor kind of arrest, but for and in some cases not even arrest, a citation. Um, but they've gotten arrested for trafficking each other, which is in no way minor, you know?
Yeah.
So because they're benefiting off the labor of another sex worker, they're now considered to be trafficking. The same thing for, like, safety rides. So people who have driven their partner, for example, if you have a partner and she's a sex worker and you drive her to her job and wait in the parking lot because you want to make sure she has a safe person there, and read a book for an hour, you could get arrested for trafficking because you are helping her. If you people will often, sex workers, or they used to, sex workers are very reticent to do this now, rent a, what you call an in-call space together. So, like, a little apartment that you work out of, and that way somebody has your back and knows where you are and knows what's
Yeah.
going on, and they share a space, and they'll, like, book their clients at different times in that space. If you share a space with a sex worker, you could get arrested for trafficking. It's even the case that if you have a roommate or a spouse who's paying rent off of sex work money, you could also get in trouble for trafficking because you are benefiting from the work of a sex worker. So all of these things that people don't think about, just like, sex workers are not these, like, lone people who are, like, just batting the world by themselves. They have friends and colleagues and spouses and roommates and people who now are being criminalized just for being around them. And that's really important to think about. And it's really important to think about because they're actually, in some cases, more, actually, in all the cases that I'm saying, more heavily criminalized than sex workers
Yeah.
themselves,
Yeah.
because trafficking is a way bigger deal than solicitation.
Right.
So I think that people ought to pay attention to that and think about what's going to happen to people who give abortion advice, who drive somebody home from a procedure, who are delivering misoproxol,
Yeah.
who are doing anything that can be seen as, who are even just offering emotional support, being somebody who stays with their, like, friend or their partner or somebody after an abortion goes, um after they're recovering from it,
Yeah. Just
because
covering.
it is a medical procedure
Yeah.
that you have to recover from. And so, I think that the way that we need to think about these things connected is, I was going to say twofold, probably manyfold, but the first two things that come to my mind is that we're talking about issues of bodily autonomy and who gets the right to say what we're allowed and not allowed to do with our bodies, what we have to do and what we can't do. There's many different ways of thinking about these things, but who decides how we use our bodies? And
Yeah.
then also, like, it's a stripping of support networks that keep people safe, and especially that keep marginalized people safe. And once you start criminalizing the people, the support networks of marginalized people, everything becomes unsafe.
Yeah. Thank you for, I think, really breaking that down. And I think also on top of this, which some of the readings touched on this week, thinking about how this does not happen solely offline.
Yeah.
That we know our lives are so interconnected with online, and that the idea of aiding and
Yeah.
abetting being part of Googling something,
Yeah.
being
Hmm.
a part of your search history,
Right.
your location history,
Yeah.
especially knowing that things like Find My or other types of trackers that
Right.
I know a lot of women use, women and femmes and marginalized people with other friends for the sense of
Yeah.
safety.
Right.
That alone can then lead to, depending on the state, depending on
Right.
the act,
Yeah.
lead to
Right.
criminality.
Right. Yeah. Like you're not allowed to tell people where you are then because that puts those people in danger,
Right.
and I think sex workers, because they have come up with all kinds of strategies to try to protect themselves and protect their spouses and protect their families. But it is actually really, really difficult given the level of surveillance. And I think, right now, Snow in their article is talking about all of the ways in which um, surveillance is tracking us. I mean, I think it's important, and this is like a very Pittsburgh based thing too. I think it's important to think about the ways that our technologies are used for policing. So one of the companies that like CMU, for example, has a lot of like with all of their their robotics programs and their AI programs and everything, have a lot of spin-off companies that are being used for policing. So one of them is Marinus Analytic, and what Marinus Analytic does is that they use facial recognition software. They have perfected facial recognition software. And the way that they tested this facial recognition software was to scrape escort ads. So, because there's now huge databases of
Yeah.
people's faces of them, and that's a criminal thing. So they've scraped all these escort ads and they've lined up those profiles with the real life social media profiles of sex workers. So matching up the faces of their escort ads with their Facebook that they have with their family and friends, and and then they were taking all of that data and selling it to the police. Like that is what they were doing with the data. So right now, it's very much the case that many sex workers who've been face out for a long time, who've been caught up in the facial recognition software, are being detained at borders, not because they've been ever arrested for anything, but because the facial recognition software going through customs is catching them and saying, no, you can't come here. You're a hooker. Like you've got to
Yeah.
go back. So I know sex workers who will avoid particular countries even for layovers because they know that they're going to get caught up in that, and their ability to travel has been so greatly hampered. And that's not getting in trouble for everything, just existing online, that the technology and the surveillance is so good now that that's very easy to put
Mhm.
together. And so I think that when we're talking about abortion, that's also important because and protesting. And I mean,
Oh
I'm
yeah,
thinking about a whole
absolutely.
bunch of things, not just abortion, but protesting. I'm always surprised when publications post the faces of people at protests.
Yeah.
That
Hmm.
seems very, very dangerous to me. And yeah, so I mean, I think that I actually don't know what to say about that because it's already happened,
Right.
and I think, and I don't want to be completely defeatist, but it's already happened. And I think that what you're trying to get at, or what I think you're trying to get at, is that these things that have happened to sex workers already, where their lives are limited by the fact that they just exist
Yeah.
as sex workers online. And we like to say that like sex work isn't a crime of status. Like, this is how I can do public things because it's not illegal to be a sex worker. Like, you can talk about being one. It's just illegal to get like caught in the act of
Right.
doing it. However,
With
that doesn't
surveillance.
there's so much surveillance that like,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, but like,
Yeah.
but there is databases where like the government knows who everybody is and what they're
Right.
doing. I mean, Eros, which is a ad site, got raided by the feds, and so I think they're still operating, which makes me think that they must be working with
Mhm.
them to keep that information flow happening. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, I think that the same thing, I don't want to say it can happen. I'm sure it's already happening with abortion. So, what we were talking about in terms of like sex workers being denied access to like movement from like place to place, we live in a country where like there's abortion access in some states and not in other states. So, people traveling cross state for abortions, like that is going to be surveilled as well.
Right.
And
Right.
so, yeah, and I'm sure already is being surveilled.
Yeah. 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 I mean, we've seen cases in smaller, not smaller, that's not the right word, but we have seen cases where it's a perhaps to the everyday person, oh, that seems like such a stretch of this law to apply this in this way,
Mhm, mhm.
to punish someone. Uh,
Yeah,
but that's precisely why we use
yeah,
phrasing like aiding and abetting, because what is,
right. Yeah, and actually I really loved in Snow's article, she talked about the fact that, like sex worker rights people have always said like, "Oh, sex workers are the canaries in the coal mine," but that metaphor actually doesn't fully work because the canaries in the coal mine made the coal workers like change their behavior.
yeah,
And that doesn't happen with sex workers. People are like, "Oh, well, whatever," to the sex workers. Like, it's too bad that's happening to them, but that we're not those
we're
people.
not, yeah,
And I think that what we need to start what sex workers have been saying, and what I think people need to actually start paying attention to, is that like it will happen to you though. Like, just wait for it to expand out. It happens to sex workers first.
right,
But then like, you even see this with like, obviously like child pornography is a problem, but you have people like is a problem as in we don't want minors like in pornography. But then you see people who are being arrested and put on sex offender registries because somebody who was underage that they didn't know was underage sent a nude,
right,
and they now have a nude and now they're sex offenders for like life. And so these laws are being stretched to penalize people beyond what's reasonable. I couldn't tell for a lot of people if they're 16 or 27. Like,
right, right,
you can't know, you don't necessarily know that stuff. And so,
right,
yeah, I mean, I think that there's a way that sex workers are the canaries in the coal mine, but ones that really need to be paid attention to. So like what is happening now? And here's a good example, I think. So when we were doing of why of how people want to just write things off as like, I'm not a sex worker, this is a sex work problem,
mhm.
so it doesn't matter.
The definition of privilege, it doesn't apply to
Yeah,
me.
doesn't apply to me. Yeah. So when I was when PJ and I were running Swab, we did a huge campaign because the DA was using condoms as an instrument of crime. So that meant that while prostitution is a low-level misdemeanor, having an instrument of crime, which is a law that was originally written for things like bulletproof vests and carrying weapons, is now being applied to in the way that you're saying, like totally taken out of context and being applied to having like a condom in your possession. which is also like related to the like walking while trans
Right.
sort of
Right.
policing. So if a trans woman, especially a trans woman of color, is walking around downtown and has 4 condoms in their bag, but they haven't even done anything, they're just there, they could get arrested for possessing an instrument of crime. In that case, the crime would be the crime of prostitution, and the instrument of crime, the thing that would allow you to do the crime, is a condom. You know, so so we put together a coalition with the ACLU and Planned Parenthood and a bunch of One Hood Media, a bunch of like people who would have been like against this. And when we argued this to DA Zappala, who I am no fan of, when we argued this to him and said, like, listen, and we got the women's law group to put together arguments, and they said, listen, the only way that you could use a condom as an instrument of crime is if you like strangled someone with it. Like,
Yeah.
none of this makes any sense. But the
Yeah.
argument too that they made was, okay, this is a public health issue, and it's
Right.
because sex workers don't just sleep with like sex workers sleep with married people, they sleep with like all kinds of people who have all kinds of other partners who then go home and have sex with their
Mhm.
wives who didn't consent to having sex with a sex worker. Like, it's not as if like this is some sort of very contained thing. We're talking
Right.
about like networks of risk, you know?
Right.
And so when we're talking about networks of risk, if you're going to like, there are a lot of people for whom, and this, like, there is a way that this makes sense. If you're a heavily policed person, like a person of color or somebody, a trans person, somebody who's going to be likely to be profiled and
Yeah.
likely to be arrested, if you think that if you're weighing out risks and you're like, okay, so if I get arrested for solicitation, or if I get like picked up for solicitation, I'll get a slap on the wrist and a fine. If I get arrested for having an instrument of crime, then I'm in the criminal justice system. And we all know that like once you've been arrested for something, it's impossible to get like out of that system.
Mhm.
Um, and you can do things like take PrEP to stop you from getting HIV, and the other sorts of STIs that you can take antibiotics for.
But how are you protecting the other person?
It makes sense in that sense to just be like, you know what, fuck the condoms. I can't risk the criminality of this. I'm not taking condoms with me,
Yeah.
right? So when you make that, when you line all of that up and you're like, okay, so now you're disincentivizing poor people from using condoms. The people that they're having sex with are going home and having sex with their spouses. They're having sex with other people. They're hooking up with all kinds of people. We cannot have this at the level of like community health. And so then they were like, okay, fine. We will not do this anymore. This is a problem. However, because you can say like it doesn't just affect sex workers, it affects other people. Um, and that was reasonable. People were like, okay, yeah, all right. Like I can't control what people do. So yeah, maybe we shouldn't disincentivize condom use. Cell phones were being used in the exact same way as instruments of crime. And they were being used that way because if a undercover cop calls a escort, texts them, sets up the appointment, and then they show up together, then that phone was the phone that was used like to facilitate the crime. And now they have an instrument of crime. And so, but you cannot make the same argument about a cell phone because a cell phone is about safety for the sex worker. It's not about safety for the civilians.
Right.
So when you say, well, you need to be able to make a safety call. Like, what if you need to call 911 because you've gotten like assaulted? What if you need to take a picture of somebody's driver's license if you're a stripper and you're doing extras and you're going home with a
Yeah.
customer, and you're like, send to your friends, like, hey, this is where I'm
Yeah.
going. If something
Safety.
happens to me, look this guy up, like all kinds of things that people were doing to remain safe. Well, you can't do that if you're not allowed to have a phone.
Yeah.
But everything dropped then. All of the support from the allies dropped at the condom use because like that is a like affects civilians. The cell phones only affect the safety of sex workers. So like, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
That sucks to be you. You shouldn't do that job.
Yep. You shouldn't do one of the oldest professions in the
Yeah.
history.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think really paying attention to when we talk about community care,
Mhm.
which community, which time,
Yeah.
um, and also, of course, understanding so many fights needing to happen simultaneously, and
Right.
also self-care as an actual self-care, not just sheet masks, but
Right.
understanding how to continue these types of fights against constant surveillance and
Yeah.
unfair legislation, while understanding, kind of as you said, like, well, this is already happening, and this,
Yeah. Hmm.
there are moments with this conversation where I'm like, everything's terrible, which,
No.
yes, but
I know. I'm like, this is not the most cheerful like thing you're going to give to your class, but
no,
yeah,
but it's important.
yeah,
It's important.
yeah. Hmm.
As we don't know what we don't know, and we know
Right, right.
knowledge is
Yeah,
power and safety.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
okay, well, I think for time's sake, we will leave it there. But thank
Okay.
you so much for all of this, and all these intersecting points that really tie things together, both, yes, digitally and in the real world. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, I will stop the recording.